And Samantha, similarly with you, you entered a sport where very, very few women. You also entered it at a relatively later age in your teens, right? When many people at least had been karting before then. You also entered the sport as a young Asian woman. And you've talked a lot about being a woman, but your cultural identity and in terms of how that was reflected in your career and growing your voice in the sport. Can you share more background on that early evolution and why you stayed so engaged in racing?
Yeah, so my journey into race car driving started at a very young age, sparked by my father, who is a very big car enthusiast and racing fan. And although he never raced himself, he would bring me to some car events and racing events when I was young. And it wasn't until I finally had the chance to drive at the age of 14 that he started enrolling me in these performance driving schools, not because he wanted me to become a race car driver, by the way, but because he wanted me to be a safe driver on the roads. And it was at one of these programs that I sat in my very first race car, and just that experience itself basically sparked my passion for racing. But like you said, I started racing when I was just 16 years old, which, many people think is very young, but for the majority of race car drivers, they actually start when they're like 4 or 5 years old in karting. So it was very different. I didn't really know that I could pursue racing as a career, so that's also what played into it. And when I first entered motorsport, I didn't really think about how male-dominated the industry was. And for context, motorsport is one of the only sports that isn't gender segregated. But I was just focused on racing at the time. But that all changed when I started facing stereotypes, the ones that are like women can't drive or Asians are bad drivers. And that's when it really hit me that, I was not just the only woman in the series, I was the only Asian woman. So my biggest challenge when I first started racing was, not having a role model that looked like me, that I could really relate to. Someone who could be a counterexample to dispel those assumptions. And consequently, when I started making mistakes as a beginner, as you do, I sometimes would think that it was because of my race or my gender. And to be a woman of color is to be underestimated, especially in an industry that is so white and male-dominated. And at times it felt that no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the narrative that was placed on me. And deciding how and when to deal with that narrative seemed like an impossible task, because on the one hand, it felt like acknowledging it meant acknowledging the people behind it, and the last thing I wanted to do was platform them. So, eventually I realized that I had to become the role model I never had, that I could become the representation I needed in a sport that deserves diversity. So I pushed through all the resistances, and knowing my performance would speak for itself eventually. And every time I had the opportunity to, I would highlight my identities so that any young girl that dreams of following in my footsteps would see that. And by breaking those barriers, I hope that I'm not just proving to myself, but also paving the way for the next generation of women and minorities who deserve a place in motorsport.